February 18, 1971. The jungles of Laos were choking on smoke, fire, and fear when a haunting question crackled through the radio. How long can one man hold back death when even the night seems alive with screams? Specialist 5 Dennis M. Fujii, a combat medic with the U.S. Army's 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment, was about to find out. What began as a desperate mission to rescue the wounded became a descent into a living nightmare that would etch his name into the blood-soaked pages of war's darkest legends. The day had turned to dusk beneath a heavy red haze, tracer rounds slicing through the thick jungle air like angry spirits. Fujii's medevac helicopter, battered by enemy fire, was moments from escape when a violent explosion tore through the tail. The aircraft spun wildly, metal screaming against gravity before crashing into the jungle floor in a burst of flame and dirt. Fujii was thrown hard into the mud, his body bruised and burned, his vision spinning. But as consciousness returned, so did the cries. The men he had come to save were scattered across the burning field, wounded, bleeding, and calling for help that might never come. Ignoring his own injuries, Fujii crawled through the smoke, dragging soldiers to cover as bullets cracked around him like snapping bones. Each movement was agony. Each scream was a reminder that he was the last line between life and the dark. The enemy was closing in. Shadows with rifles and bayonets, their voices echoing through the trees in ghostly chants. The air reeked of cordite and death, and the ground trembled with the pounding of mortars. Fujii found himself cut off, stranded with South Vietnamese troops at Landing Zone Ranger North, surrounded on all sides by North Vietnamese forces that outnumbered them nearly 10-1. The radio operator had been killed, the command chain shattered, and yet, amidst the chaos, Fujii took the mic. His calm voice broke through the static, calling for air support, guiding pilots with eerie precision through the wall of smoke. "Drop it closer," he ordered, as if death itself were something he could direct. The airstrikes roared overhead, turning the jungle into a molten landscape of flame and screams. But the enemy didn't stop. They crawled through the fire like shadows that refused to die. For nearly 3 days, Fujii stayed behind enemy lines, refusing every chance to be rescued. On February 19th, medevac helicopters tried to reach him again, but each one was shot to pieces before it could land. He waved them off with blood-stained hands, shouting into the wind, "Get them first, I'll stay." That night, rain poured down in sheets, washing blood and mud into rivers that carried the fallen away. Fujii crouched beside the wounded, using his bare hands to plug bullet holes, tearing his own shirt to make bandages, whispering words of comfort to men who were already half gone. The jungle became a graveyard lit by lightning and fire, where every shadow might be an enemy, and every breath a borrowed one. At one point, a mortar landed so close that it hurled him across the ground. When he opened his eyes, he found himself staring into the lifeless face of a soldier he had treated hours before. The young man's helmet was split open, his eyes glassy and unblinking, his mouth frozen mid-cry. Fujii pressed his hand over the boy's chest, whispering a prayer as the battle screamed on around him. By the second night, his radio was nearly dead, his body covered in mud and blood, his exhaustion beyond words. Yet, when the pilots called for guidance, his voice came through, steady, quiet, almost ghost-like. "You're on target. Fire again." The airstrikes answered his call, unleashing hell upon the jungle, shaking the earth until it seemed the world itself was dying. But for every enemy that fell, 3 more appeared. The South Vietnamese troops who fought beside him said later that Fujii seemed unbreakable, like he had made peace with death and was bargaining with it for time. He moved through the battlefield like a phantom, dragging the wounded from burning trenches, covering them with his own body when the mortars fell too close. The smell of burnt foliage and flesh filled the air. The cries of the dying blended with the endless drone of insects and the crackle of fire. Even the jungle animals had fled. Only the dead and the damned remained. On the morning of February 22, 1971, after nearly 4 nights of horror, a rescue helicopter finally broke through the enemy line. Fujii, half-conscious and staggering, refused to board until every wounded man had been lifted out. When he was finally dragged aboard, his skin was gray, his uniform shredded, and his hand still trembling from holding the dying for too long. As the chopper lifted off, he looked down at the field, a blackened scar upon the earth littered with twisted helmets and broken rifles. In that silence, he could almost hear the jungle breathe again, as if the dead themselves were watching him leave. Fujii's selflessness had saved countless lives, but it also left him haunted. Fellow soldiers later said he spoke little of those days, as if words would awaken the ghosts that never left him. The army called him a hero. The men who saw him that night called him something else. The man who stood alone when the world ended. Years later, when Specialist 5 Dennis M. Fujii finally received the Medal of Honor, his voice shook as he accepted it, not from pride, but from the weight of memory. He had not fought for glory. He had fought because he could not abandon those who still had breath left in them. Behind his quiet eyes, the fires of Laos still burned. Flashes of tracer fire, faces of the fallen, the taste of ash and rain. He never called himself brave, but history did. Because when every instinct told him to run, Fujii stayed, in the middle of the storm, surrounded by death, holding on to hope with bloody hands. So the question remains, echoing across generations, like the ghostly hum of those jungle nights. When the darkness closes in and the world is burning around you, would you have the courage to stay behind and face it alone?